The smoke still rose from the ashes when they found her footprints, perfect impressions in the mud, leading away from what had been the grandest mansion in all of Georgia, now nothing more than smouldering ruins and memories. But these weren't ordinary footprints. The mud around them had been baked hard as pottery, as if something impossibly hot had passed through. And strangest of all, they led in a perfectly straight line toward the swamplands, never deviating, never stumbling, as if whoever made them had walked with absolute purpose through the chaos of a collapsing inferno. The year was 1819, and the aftermath of the War of 1812 had left much of the young nation struggling to rebuild. But in the rolling hills outside Savannah, one woman had seemed immune to the hardships that plagued her neighbors. Baroness Helena Volkov had arrived from Russia 3 years prior, purchasing the largest plantation in the county with gold that seemed to flow as endlessly as water from a well. She spoke perfect English with only the faintest trace of an accent, carried herself with the poise of European nobility, and possessed a beauty that men would later describe as otherworldly. But it was her gardens that truly set her apart. In a climate where even the hardiest crops struggled, Helena's grounds bloomed with impossible abundance. Roses that should have withered in the Georgian heat grew larger than dinner plates. Fruit trees bore harvest after harvest, their branches heavy with produce even in the depths of winter. Vegetables grew to enormous sizes, and flowers bloomed in colors that seemed to shift and change depending on who was looking at them. The neighboring planters whispered among themselves. Thomas Whitmore, whose own cotton fields had been devastated by boll weevil, would stand at his property line and stare across at Helena's thriving crops with a mixture of envy and unease. His wife, Margaret, had tried to befriend the mysterious Baroness, bringing preserves and invitations to church socials, but Helena received these gestures with polite indifference, as if mortal concerns were beneath her notice. It was young Samuel Hartwell who first noticed something truly strange about the Baroness. The boy, barely 16 and apprenticed to the local blacksmith, had been delivering horseshoes to Helena's stable when he glimpsed her in her garden. She stood among the roses in the noon heat, wearing a heavy velvet gown that should have been unbearable in the Georgia sun. But what made his blood run cold was what he saw next. The air around her shimmered like heat waves, but the shimmer was moving inward toward her as if she were drawing the very warmth from her surroundings into herself. Samuel ran from the estate that day and told no one what he'd seen, but the image haunted him. That night, and many nights after, he would wake from dreams of burning roses and a woman whose touch could ignite the very air. As autumn turned to winter, Helena's behavior grew even more peculiar. She began hosting elaborate dinner parties, but no one ever saw guests arrive or depart. The windows of her mansion would blaze with light, and shadow would dance against the walls, suggesting dozens of people moving within. Yet the roads leading to her estate remained empty. When brave souls ventured close enough to listen, they heard music unlike anything played in America, wild and haunting melodies that seemed to come from instruments that shouldn't exist. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison, the county's physician and a man of science who prided himself on rational thought, became obsessed with understanding Helena's impossible garden. He had studied botany at Harvard and knew that what he witnessed defied every law of nature he understood. Plants that should have been dormant in winter continued to grow. Soil that should have been exhausted after such abundant harvests remained rich and dark. And there was something else, something that made his physician's instincts scream warnings he couldn't articulate. The temperature around Helena's property was wrong. Even on the coldest January days, when frost covered every surface for miles around, the air within 100 yards of her mansion remained warm and humid, thick with the scent of blooming flowers. Dr. Morrison began taking precise measurements, mapping the strange warm zone that surrounded the estate. What he discovered made no sense. The temperature gradient was too sharp, too defined, as if some invisible barrier contained an entirely different climate. It was Margaret Whitmore who first dared to speak the word that others had been thinking. Witch. She said it quietly at first, in whispered conversations with her closest friends. But as winter deepened and Helena's impossible garden continued to flourish, the whispers grew louder. Margaret had been raised on stories of Salem, of women who had made bargains with dark forces, and there was something about Helena that reminded her of those old tales, something in the way the woman's eyes seemed to hold depths that went far beyond the physical. The breaking point came on February 14th, 1820. Valentine's Day had brought an unexpected blizzard to Georgia, a freak storm that left 3 feet of snow on the ground and temperatures that plummeted to levels not seen in living memory. Across the county, livestock froze in their pens and families huddled around meager fires, burning furniture to keep warm. But from Helena's estate, witnesses reported, the snow melted before it could touch the ground. The very air above her mansion seemed to glow with warmth, and her gardens continued to bloom as if it were the height of spring. That night, driven by cold, hunger, and growing desperation, a group of men from the surrounding farms decided they had tolerated Helena's unnatural prosperity long enough. Led by Thomas Whitmore and backed by Dr. Morrison's scientific curiosity and Margaret's religious fervor, they marched through the snow toward the glowing mansion. They carried torches, pitchforks, and the absolute certainty that they were confronting something that threatened the natural order. They found Helena waiting for them in her garden, standing among roses that bloomed impossibly large and red in the falling snow. She wore the same velvet gown Samuel had seen her in months before, but now it seemed to radiate heat of its own. The snow melted in a perfect circle around her feet, revealing rich, dark earth that steamed in the frigid air. Thomas Whitmore stepped forward, his breath coming in great white puffs as he spoke. "Helena Volkov, if that's even your real name, we know what you are. We've seen your devil's garden, felt your unnatural heat. This county won't harbor a witch." Helena regarded them with eyes that seemed to hold the depth of centuries. When she spoke, her voice carried an accent that was suddenly unmistakably foreign, older and stranger than Russian. "You speak of things you do not understand, little men. You think the cold is your enemy, but cold is merely the absence of warmth. I am warmth itself. I am the fire that burns in the heart of the world." Dr. Morrison, emboldened by his scientific training, stepped closer with a thermometer in his shaking hands. "Explain it then. Show us how you violate the laws of nature. Make us understand." Helena smiled, and in that smile was something terrible and beautiful. "Very well, Doctor. You wish to understand heat? To measure it? Then measure this." She raised her hand, and the air around her began to shimmer more intensely. The roses at her feet, already impossibly large, began to grow even larger, their petals darkening from red to deep crimson to something that was almost black. The snow, in an ever-widening circle, began to melt, then steam, then disappear entirely as the ground beneath became warm, then hot, then began to glow like embers. "She's doing it, Doctor," Morrison whispered, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. "She's actually controlling heat itself." But Thomas Whitmore was a man of action, not contemplation. Seeing what he was certain was witchcraft, he lunged forward with his pitchfork, aiming for Helena's heart. The weapon should have found its mark, but instead it burst into flames the moment it came within 3 feet of her. Thomas dropped it with a cry of pain, his hands blistered from the superheated metal. "You want fire?" Helena asked, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in their bones. "You came here with torches, seeking to burn out what you don't understand. Let me show you true fire." She stepped toward the mansion, and with each step, the temperature rose. The wooden siding began to smoke, then char, then burst into flames that burned with colors that had no names. But these were not the chaotic flames of a normal fire. They moved with purpose, flowing like water, climbing the walls in perfect spirals, consuming the building with mathematical precision. The men who had come to confront her backed away as the heat became unbearable. But Helena continued walking, directly into the inferno she had created. They watched in horrified fascination as she entered the burning building, the flames parting before her like curtains, never touching her, never harming her. From inside the mansion came sounds that defied description, not the crackling of burning wood or the crash of falling timbers, but something that sounded almost like music, as if the fire itself were singing. The walls glowed from within, and shadows moved behind the windows, shadows that danced with too much purpose, too much coordination to be merely the play of flame and smoke. Samuel Hartwell, who had followed the older men despite his youth, would later swear that he saw faces in those flames. Not human faces, but something older, more primal, creatures of pure heat and light that swirled around Helena like worshippers around a goddess. The fire was not consuming the mansion, he realized. It was transforming it, changing it into something else entirely. For nearly an hour the impossible inferno raged, burning without smoke, consuming without destroying, transforming wood and stone into something that hurt to look at directly. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fire began to change. The wild, chaotic flames drew inward, condensing, concentrating, until the entire mansion had become a single pillar of white-hot flame that rose straight up into the night sky. And then Helena emerged. She walked out of the pillar of fire as casually as someone stepping out of their front door, but she had changed. Her velvet gown had been replaced by something that looked like it was woven from flame itself, shifting and flowing around her body without ever quite touching her skin. Her hair, which had been dark brown, now held threads of gold and red that moved like living fire. And her eyes now held the deep, endless glow of coals that would never grow cold. She looked at the cowering men with something that might have been pity. "You wanted to understand heat," she said, her voice now carrying the sound of crackling flames. "Here is your lesson. Heat is life itself. It is the force that drives every living thing, the energy that flows through every vein, the power that makes hearts beat and lungs draw breath. You fear it because you are cold creatures, barely alive, clinging to the tiny spark that keeps you from becoming corpses." Dr. Morrison, his scientific mind reeling, managed to stammer out a question. "What are you?" Helena considered this for a moment, as if deciding how much truth these mortal minds could bear. "I am what your kind calls a salamander. Not the small lizard that bears our name, but the true salamander, the elemental of fire itself. I came to this place because it was warm, because the earth here holds veins of fire deep below the surface. I made my garden grow, because all life needs warmth to flourish. I lived among you peacefully, harming none, asking for nothing but to exist." She gestured toward the pillar of flame that had been her mansion. "But you could not leave me in peace. You brought your cold suspicions, your frozen hearts, your determination to destroy what you could not understand. So now I will return to where I belong, to the fires that burn in the heart of the world." The pillar of flame behind her began to sink into the ground, boring down through earth and stone like a molten drill. The heat was so intense that the men were forced to retreat further, shielding their faces from the radiation that emanated from the descending fire. Helena began walking toward the column, but as she did, she spoke one final time. "Remember this night, cold creatures. Remember that there are forces in this world older and more powerful than your small understanding. Remember that warmth is a gift, not a right, and that winter is always waiting just beyond your hearth fires." She reached the edge of the descending pillar and stepped into it without hesitation. The fire welcomed her, embracing her, and for just a moment those watching saw her true form, Not a human woman at all, but something made of living flame, beautiful and terrible and utterly alien to mortal comprehension. The pillar continued to descend, carrying her down into the depths of the earth, down toward fires that had burned since the world was young. As it sank, the ground around it began to change. The rich, fertile soil that had nurtured Helena's impossible garden became ordinary earth once more. The supernatural warmth that had defied winter's grip dissipated, and the natural cold of February night reclaimed the land. When the last of the fire had vanished into the earth, the men found themselves standing in an ordinary field, covered with ordinary snow under ordinary stars. Where Helena's mansion had stood, there was nothing but a perfectly circular patch of ground that remained warm to the touch, and in the center of that circle, the footprints that led away toward the swamp. But those footprints told a different story than the one they had just witnessed. They suggested that Helena had not descended into the earth at all, but had instead walked away across the surface, leaving behind only the illusion of her fiery departure. The prints were deep, pressed into ground that had been baked hard by impossible heat, and they led in a straight line toward the dark waters of the Okefenokee swamp. Thomas Whitmore, his hands still bandaged from the burns he'd received, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. She's still alive. Still out there somewhere. Dr. Morrison, his scientific skepticism shattered by what he'd witnessed, could only nod. He had taken careful notes throughout the encounter, measurements and observations that filled 3 leather-bound journals. But when he returned to his study and tried to write up his findings, the words seemed to rearrange themselves on the page, becoming incomprehensible symbols that hurt his eyes to look at. In the weeks that followed, strange reports began to filter in from throughout the Georgia lowlands. Travelers spoke of seeing a woman in a gown of fire walking through the darkest parts of the swamp, her footsteps leaving smoldering prints in the mud. Hunters claimed that game animals would gather around her as she passed, as if seeking the warmth she radiated. And the Seminole Indians, who had long considered the deep swamps to be sacred ground, began to speak of a fire spirit that had come to live among the ancient cypress trees. Samuel Hartwell, now a man haunted by what he'd seen, began to document these sightings. He traveled throughout the region, collecting stories from anyone who claimed to have encountered the mysterious woman. What emerged was a pattern that defied rational explanation. Helena, or whatever she truly was, seemed to be following the underground streams and rivers that flowed beneath Georgia, drawn by some force that only she understood. A year after that terrible night, Samuel made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about Helena's true nature. While researching land records in the Savannah courthouse, he found documents that dated back to the earliest colonial settlements. Buried among the yellowed papers was a report from 1733 describing the establishment of the first plantation in the area where Helena had built her mansion. The report mentioned that the original settlers had been forced to abandon their first attempt at building on that land because of unnatural heat emanating from the earth itself. Subsequent attempts to farm the area had failed when crops withered from excessive warmth. Even in the depths of winter, the land had remained unused for decades until Helena's arrival, as if it had been waiting for someone who could not only tolerate but thrive in the supernatural heat that rose from below. But there was more. Samuel found similar reports scattered throughout the colonial records, dating back over a century. A mysterious fire in 1782 that had consumed the entire plantation but left the surrounding forest untouched. Accounts from the Revolutionary War of British soldiers reporting encounters with a woman who could walk through cannon fire without being harmed. Even earlier records from Spanish explorers who had written of meeting a flame-haired woman in the swamplands who spoke in tongues of fire. The evidence suggested something that chilled Samuel to the bone. Helena hadn't come to Georgia from Russia in 1817. She had been in the area for generations, perhaps centuries, appearing and disappearing like a spirit of the land itself. The Russian Baroness identity had been nothing more than a convenient disguise, a way to explain her presence to a community that might have been more suspicious of a woman with no documented past. Armed with this knowledge, Samuel ventured into the Okefenokee swamp, following the old Seminole trails deeper into the wetlands than any white man had gone before. The Indian guides he hired would only take him so far before their fear overcame their need for payment. They spoke in hushed tones of the Fire Woman, describing her as a force of nature that was neither good nor evil, but simply too powerful for mortal minds to comprehend. Deep in the swamp, where the cypress trees grew so thick that daylight never reached the ground, Samuel found what he was looking for. A small island, perhaps 50 feet across, that remained warm even in the depths of winter. The water around it steamed gently, and the vegetation grew with the same impossible abundance that had characterized Helena's garden. And there, at the center of the island, stood a simple cabin that seemed to radiate heat like a banked fire. He never saw Helena that day, but he knew she was aware of his presence. The air around the cabin shimmered with the same heat distortion he remembered from that first glimpse of her in the rose garden. Flowers bloomed around his feet as he approached, and the mud beneath his boots grew warm and soft. On the cabin's porch sat a single chair, as if she had been expecting him. Samuel left a letter on that chair, a message he had written and rewritten a dozen times. In it, he asked not for explanations or revelations, but simply for understanding. He wanted to know if she was alone in the world, if there were others like her, if the fire that burned within her was a blessing or a curse. When he returned to the island a month later, the letter was gone. In its place was a single white rose, still warm to the touch despite the February cold. Tucked among its petals was a note written in handwriting that seemed to flicker and dance like flame across the page. The message was brief. Fire does not explain itself to those who have never burned. Samuel understood. Some truths were too vast, too fundamental to be reduced to words that human minds could process. Helena was what she was, a force of nature, given form, a creature of pure elemental power that had chosen to walk among mortals for reasons of her own. To truly understand her would require becoming something more than human, and that transformation came with a price he was not prepared to pay. He left the swamp that day and never returned. But he continued to collect stories about the Fire Woman, documenting sightings that stretched across decades and eventually centuries. The reports followed a pattern, appearing in times of great cold or disaster, when people most needed the warmth she could provide. During the harsh winter of 1857, she was seen in the mountains of North Carolina, her presence warming entire valleys. In the aftermath of the Civil War, soldiers on both sides reported encounters with a mysterious woman whose touch could heal frostbite and whose breath could rekindle dying fires. The last verified sighting came in 1962, when a NASA engineer named David Patterson claimed to have met her while conducting tests in the Everglades. According to his report, which was quickly buried in classified files, she had approached his camp one night when the air conditioning had failed and the Florida heat had become unbearable. Instead of suffering in the oppressive humidity, his team had found themselves surrounded by a dry, comfortable warmth that had nothing to do with the climate around them. Patterson described her as ageless, neither young nor old, but carrying herself with the weight of centuries. She had stayed only long enough to ensure the team's safety, but before leaving, she had made a prediction that haunted him for the rest of his life. Your kind will learn to harness fire as we do, but you will never understand its true nature. You see only destruction where we see creation, only burning where we see transformation. When you finally split the atom and release the fires that burn in the heart of matter itself, remember that every flame is alive, and some fires burned too bright for mortal hands to hold. The report noted that Patterson had tried to photograph her, but every image came out as nothing but streaks of light and heat distortion. When he asked her name, she had smiled and answered, "I am called by many names in many languages, but you may think of me as Helena, if it comforts you." Names are just sounds that mortals use to feel they understand things that cannot be understood. As she prepared to leave, Patterson had asked the question that Samuel Hartwell had posed over a century earlier. Was she alone in the world? Her answer had chilled him more than any winter wind. We are never alone. We are simply waiting. When the world grows cold enough, when the fires that warm human hearts begin to die out, we will return. Not to conquer or destroy, but to remind you of what you are in danger of losing. Fire is not just heat and light. Fire is the force that transforms everything it touches, that turns wood to ash, and ash to soil, and soil to new life. Without fire, there is only cold stone and empty darkness. Remember that when the time comes to choose. The Patterson Report was the last official document to mention Helena Volkov by name. But across the American Southeast, stories persist of a woman in white who appears during the coldest nights of winter, bringing warmth to those who need it most. Children lost in snowstorms speak of being guided home by a lady whose hands were warm as summer sunshine. Firefighters tell tales of a mysterious woman who appears at the worst blazes, not to fight the flames, but to direct them away from the innocent, to ensure that the fire consumes only what needs to be burned. And in the deepest parts of the Okefenokee swamp, where the cypress trees have stood since before human memory began, there is still an island that never grows cold. The Seminole people consider it sacred ground, a place where the spirit of fire itself has chosen to make its home. They leave offerings there sometimes, not in worship, but in recognition of a force too ancient and powerful to ignore. Because they understand what the white settlers never could, that fire is not humanity's servant, but its teacher, not a tool to be controlled, but a gift to be respected. And somewhere in those dark waters, where the boundary between the physical world and the realm of elemental forces grows thin, Helena Volkov continues to wait, patient as flames that have burned since the beginning of time, ready to remind the world that some powers are too fundamental to be explained, too essential to be destroyed, and too beautiful to be forgotten.